Chapter 11. The Crucible. The Prince of Ravens, the nameless prince, the exiled prince, the only prince of the realm ever cast down in the history of the Empire, woke in darkness, with no identity, no hope, and nothing to hold him together. He had been the seventh son of the Empress. Then he had been a kidnapped prince, a wronged prince, hunted by his traitorous brothers and sisters, but still true to his purpose. Now he was nothing. He sat silently where he had woken, propped against a stone wall, not seeing the cell in which he had been caged, not feeling the cold metal cuffs connected to large metal chains that held him by the wrist. He did not feel the day-old burn from the exile girl's dagger in the palm of his hand, nor the swelling of his still-healing ankle, aggravated by his race through Baneland. Even the Raven talisman was silent and cool on his shoulders and back, though there was more than enough life around him to encourage it to wake. He simply floated, in an unfeeling void, detached from the world. All that had happened since leaving the fortress went slowly, repeatedly through his mind. Tomaz, the exile girl, the death watchman, Baneland, the path of light, pine trees, hunger, sunlight, darkness. Tomaz, the exile girl, the death watchman. The thing that he felt most, though, as he sat alone in the darkness, was shame. Shame that he had somehow been negligent in his duty as a prince. Shame that he had disappointed his mother. Shame that he hadn't seen the betrayal for what it was. Shame that he had wandered stupidly into the hands of the Seeker. But as the hours passed, then days, the shame hardened into anger. What had he done to deserve it all? What had he done to offend the Empress? Nothing. Nothing. He had been a model son. True, he was no Ricard, but he had been a good prince. He had been a good son. So why? What had he done? What had he done? He shot to his feet and let out a scream of anger mingled with despair that reverberated around the cell, bouncing off the unfeeling walls. He knew no one would hear him, and even if someone did, he was in the bowels of a Seeker's lair, and all here were convinced of his guilt to a crime he didn't even know he'd committed. He screamed again, pulling against his chains, the manacles digging into his skin and drawing blood that began to flow down his arms in hot rivulets. He continued shouting, cursing the Seeker, cursing the world, cursing himself for being so stupid as to deliver himself up for slaughter, right into the Seeker's trap, into his mother's trap. He continued to rage alone in his cell, trying to deny what was true, trying to convince himself that it was all a dream, but coming back again and again to the hard reality of his imprisonment. Hard reality. He had to be harder to deal with it. That was the answer. He pushed his emotions into a tight ball in his stomach. He wanted to refuse to accept what had happened, but he couldn't. He wanted to lose his mind, but some last shred of himself, whoever he was, kept him clinging to sanity. In the end, it was the nothingness of sleep that claimed him, the mercy of empty dreams. He slept fitfully, in between bouts of rage. Sometimes there was food waiting for him when he woke, just at the edge of the length of his bonds. Sometimes there were rats that shared the cell with him, and sometimes fleas bit him as he lay on the straw that was his only bit of comfort. During moments of lucidity, he wondered which of the children would come to retrieve him, and how long it would take them to arrive. How many days did he have left to live? How many days until he reached the fortress, this time in chains, and was killed? He wondered how he would be killed. If his mother would do it, or one of the children. His mind began to slip in and out of consciousness with no apparent preference. He sat in the same position regardless of sleeping or waking, slumped against a cold stone wall. His back grew cramped and hunched. He did not care, though. Things like a straight back didn't matter anymore. What point was there in appearance when he was soon to die? To die. He knew what it was to die. He had experienced it so many times before, and yet this time it would be truly his experience. Finally, as he sat in the dark with his black thoughts, the door to his cell creaked open, and he knew that his time was up. He stood, his legs weak but still strong enough to lift him to his feet. He would face whoever had come to retrieve him standing. He had been the Prince of Ravens, and he swore that whoever had come for him would not forget it as they led him to his death. 2 lesser Seekers came in, with black robes and cloaks and the single gold rope of their office. Their faces were covered with black cloth masks, meant to remind them of their own insignificance, and golden 7-point stars hung around their necks to remind them of the Empress at all times. The prince examined them and found himself amused. One, hunched over with age, was in robes and a cloak far too small, and the other, standing as tall and straight as possible, was trying to fill robes that were far too large. "Is money scarce?" he taunted them, his voice coming out in a croak past chapped lips and a raw throat. "You know you could always deliver me to the Empress yourself. I'm sure there's a bounty to be had." "Don't tempt me," said the smaller of the two in a female voice. She pushed back the hood of her cloak and removed the black mask. The prince's mouth dropped open as long black hair fell down to frame the face of the exile girl. The bigger of the two stopped hunching over and stood up straight, pulling back his hood and mask to reveal Tomas's bearded face. What are you doing here?" "Being stupid," grumbled the girl, casting a long, suffering look at Tomas, who had turned back to press his ear against the door. She reached into her stolen robes and produced one of her long daggers, moving to the prince's right, and she began to pry at the locks that chained him to the wall. "But you're impersonating seekers. You could be exiled for that." Both of them paused and looked at him. The prince felt his cheeks grow hot. "Why are you risking your lives for me? You shouldn't be here. You should be halfway back to wherever it is you were taking me in the first place." The girl didn't respond, but he felt her hesitate for the briefest of seconds before attacking the lock with renewed vigor. Tomas turned slightly and responded in a quiet rumble. "You're one of us now," he said simply. The statement brought everything crashing back down on him that the shock of seeing the exiles had momentarily driven out. Some tiny shred of his loyalty to the Empire remained, though, not to his mother and the children, but to the Empire itself and what it represented. He felt a surge of anger against the two outlaws. His resentment was still hot, and the rejection too new. "No, I will never be one of you." He twisted as much as the change would allow, throwing the girl off. In the next second, her dagger was pressed against his throat. "Try that again, princeling," she snarled. "Eshandai, now is not the time," Tomas said quickly. He turned to the prince. "If you come with us, you live," he said bluntly. "If you stay here, you die." The girl and the prince were almost nose to nose, glaring hatefully at each other. The noise of a far-off grate swinging open came from outside the door, and then sounds of feet tramping across a corridor above them. "I would rather die than become an exile," the prince said finally. The girl pushed herself off of him and spun, glaring at Tomas. The big man moved forward so quickly he was a blur until suddenly the enormous, bearded face appeared above the prince. "Where there is life," the big man rumbled, "there is hope. Do not turn your back on us, we who are trying to save your life the same way that they have turned their backs on you. There are times when bad things happen. We cannot stop those things no matter how hard we try. But what makes a man is that he continues on, regardless. That he stands up again, and that he learns from what has knocked him down." The prince felt something shift deep inside him, and he blinked several times, breaking eye contact with Tomas. There came more sounds from outside the cell, and the girl made an impatient sound, but Tomas held up a hand to her and she fell silent. "Where would I go?" the prince asked. "You would go with us," Tomas said. "To the land of the exiled kindred," the prince said, "where I'll be treated as a prisoner of war, where I'll be tortured for information if I decide not to give it willingly." "I told you he was going to be an idiot like this," said the girl. "And what would you do in my place?" he snapped back at her. The girl stared at him, her nostrils flared. But then she looked down slightly and seemed to truly consider the question. When she looked back up, her eyes were blazing once more. "I would live," she said. "I would live just to spite those bastards that want you dead." The prince held her gaze for a long moment, and the anger he felt, the pain, hardened into something sharp and strong. It cut him, but it gave him strength. "Fine," he said. "Unchain me." "Fantastic," the girl said. "You better be worth this trouble, Tomas." The sounds outside the cell became louder, and it became clear that the Seeker's headquarters was in an uproar. An alarm bell began to ring. "They've discovered our presence," Tomas said grimly. "How?" the girl asked. "We stored the searchers." "No doubt my cell is enchanted," the prince said. "Blood mages could have placed enchantments around the door and the lock. "Why didn't you tell us?" the girl hissed. "I didn't know you were coming," the prince said. There was a sound of a key scraping in the lock, and the prince fell silent. The girl and Tomas switched places, the girl taking position beside the door in the shadows, and Tomas approaching the prince, grabbing the chains that were holding him in place. Clenching them in his enormous fist, Tomas threw his full weight against the restraints. With a screech like a dying animal, the chains came out of the wall in a shower of powdered stone and mortar. The door opened, and 3 guards entered with swords already half drawn. Tomas and the prince, still in chains but no longer tethered to the wall, kept a safe distance. The guards saw them and immediately spread out in formation, coming further into the room. They never even saw the exile girl. There was a blurred series of movements, and then all 3 men lay motionless on the floor, the girl standing calmly over them as she sheathed her daggers. Shadows and light, she's good. There was a strange tugging sensation on the prince's arms, and he turned to see Tomas pulling apart the links of the chains with fingers the size of sausages, once again accompanied by the tortured scream of metal. Not 2 seconds later, the prince was left only with the manacles and a bit of chain hanging from each. "Shadows and light," he whispered, astonished. "You're welcome," Tomas responded. "We very much need to leave," the girl said, looking into the corridor. "There are going to be a lot of people here very soon." Tomas grabbed the prince by the scruff of the neck and pulled him toward the door until the prince began to walk on his own. Once in the hallway, a short stone corridor lined with torches and wall brackets, they turned right, the prince following the lead of the exiles, as he had no idea where they were. Both Tomas and the girl had pulled their hoods and masks back on, though the prince was unsure what help that would be since he, the top security prisoner, was with them. They rounded a corner and were presented with a set of iron bars that spanned ceiling to floor. "Shadows and fire, this wasn't here before," the girl said. Tomas motioned the prince and the girl out of the way, obviously ready to attempt to break through the bars. "Wait," the prince said. He stepped forward. "We don't have time to wait, princeling," the girl said. The prince ignored her and continued examining the bars. Near the top of the farthest right bar, he saw what he was looking for. "There," he said, pointing. It was a small mark most people would have missed, but one that the prince had been trained to notice on all things. It was a red, tear-shaped droplet of blood, the sign of the blood mages. With an awkward, jerky movement, trying to avoid hitting the bars with the manacles still dangling from his wrists, he reached up and touched the symbol with his thumb. The bars shot up into the ceiling, leaving the hallway clear. The prince motioned for them to follow him through. "Blood mages draw their power from all 7 talismans," he said. "As long as I'm connected to the Raven, nothing they make can keep me out, even if the entire empire is hunting me. That's why Tomas could break my chains. They were just metal. If they had been enchanted, they wouldn't have been able to hold me. Now, don't we have somewhere to be?" The girl brushed past him, Tomas following quickly behind. They rounded another corner as a group of guards came into the corridor not 20 yards further up. Luckily, they hadn't spotted them, or else they thought that they were all lesser seekers, the prince hiding behind Tomas's conveniently large bulk. The prince and the exiles rounded another corner and came to a small staircase leading upward. 2 guards were stationed at the bottom, and they caught sight of the 3 immediately. "Stay where you are," one of them called, but it was too late. The prince and the girl, side by side, hurtled forward, taking the guards by surprise. Falling back on his training once more, the prince used the same joint-locking technique he had used on the Death Watch soldier what seemed so long ago now. The man fell in a heap at the prince's feet, but as the prince turned away, the man reached out and pulled his foot out from under him. He fell flat on his face, slapping his hands against the ground to absorb the shock of the blow. Stars winked at the edge of his vision, but as he looked up, he saw a dagger sticking out of the exile girl's boot. He lunged for it, caught the handle, and spun, slicing the guard's bicep, rendering his arm useless. The prince rolled to his feet, crouching over the guard, staring into the man's frightened eyes. This was good. Now he would be stronger and faster. He raised the dagger high. His mind flashed back to the Death Watch soldier in the mountains. With a growl of anger, he flipped the dagger up into the air, grabbed it dexterously by the blade guard, and smashed the end of the hilt into the man's temple, knocking him out cold, but leaving him alive. He rose, dagger still in hand, and turned to see the exiles staring at him. "Why didn't you kill him?" the girl asked. The prince, nerves considerably on edge after his imprisonment, responded so viciously he was nearly snarling. "I don't kill unless I have to, remember? That's an exile's job." If he had expected her to look hurt, or stung, or affected at all, he was sorely disappointed. She simply stared at him, her face cold and dispassionate. Tamaz muttered something to her that the prince couldn't hear, something that sounded like, "worth the trouble." Before he could ask, there was a sound behind him, and they all whirled to face it. A number of men rounded the corner, some dressed in the black of the searchers. One pointed at them and gave a cry. "Quickly," Tamaz said, "up the stairs." The prince held out the dagger to the girl, offering it back, but she shook her head. "Keep it. You'll need it." The three of them made their way up the stone staircase, disappearing around the first curve. They continued to climb for ages, going around and always upward. The prince, kept in confinement for a week, tied to a wall and fed little more than starvation rations, felt his strength ebbing away as his feet began to drag like lead weights. The exiles began to pull ahead of him. Gasping, he hurried to catch up, hearing the alarm bells still ringing in the distance, knowing that this was his only chance to escape. Through one final door, and he found himself out in chill night air. He looked around, confused, and realized they were high up on one of the towers spaced along the wall of the inner city. He remembered that he had entered the lair through the cathedral. The Seeker's headquarters must be enormous. It might expand out underneath the entire city of Bainland, and if this was a way out as well, then who was to say there weren't multiple entrances and exits throughout the city? He looked over the wall and found he could see across Bainland City proper, all the way to the Black Wall. Making his way to the side, he looked down over into the courtyard, and saw guards running back and forth, the entire city of the Most High in an uproar. "Now what?" he asked. "Along the wall," Tamaz said, motioning behind him. The prince turned. The tower was connected to the top of the wall by a long battlement, running toward the main gate and another door. There were guards stationed every few yards. "How are we going to do that?" the prince asked. Tamaz just smiled at him. He reached down and picked up a long piece of wood from a large pile that the prince assumed was for making signal fires. Tamaz motioned to the girl. "Ready?" he asked her. "Catch me if you can," she said with a grin, and shot off down the runway. What in the name of the Empress is she doing?" Tamaz didn't respond, but instead took off after her. The prince, not knowing what else to do, ran as fast as he could behind them, the metal chains of his manacles striking his sides. The first guard turned just in time to see the girl make her way past him, and he turned and ran after her, though how he thought he'd catch her wearing full armor the prince didn't know. The second guard, alerted to her presence, turned and drew his sword, ready for her to attack. But once more she blew right past him, and he turned to follow as well, not even noticing the hulking shape of Tamaz and the smaller shape of the prince making their way down the battlements after them. There were a dozen guards in all, and the girl dodged each of them, as if she were in a foot race that only she knew about, and they the obstacles. She reached the door at the end of the battlement, turned back, and threw up her hands in surrender. The guards slowed, confused and wary, all watching her and standing in a clump. Tamaz came up behind them, wielding the large piece of wood. Two of the guards went down before they even knew what was happening, the hard wood smashing into the sides of their helmets and knocking them out. The others turned in alarm and drew their swords, only to be attacked by the girl. In a matter of seconds, all 12 were down, unconscious. The prince was at a loss for words. It took him a moment to realize that the girl had turned to the door but couldn't open it. He stepped forward and shouldered her out of the way, recognizing the Mage's Knot, one of the simple puzzle combination locks popular with the Most High this year. "A 3-year-old could open this, you know that?" he asked the girl. He twisted the wooden pegs around in the socket so that they formed a triangle, and then pushed. The door swung open, showing another spiral stone staircase, this one leading down. "Well, I'm so grateful that we have you around to open the tricky doors," the girl said, elbowing her way past him. She turned back before descending. "I'll just take care of all the guards, and the rescuing, and she smiled sweetly at him, the manly things." She turned and disappeared down the staircase. Tamaz followed her quickly, chuckling to himself. "Damn exiles," the prince muttered under his breath. At the base of the tower they emerged in the same gatehouse the prince had made his way through on the path of light. This time it was free of guards, but contained instead 2 searchers and, in a ridiculous coincidence, the Lord Seeker himself. The 2 trios stood staring at each other for a long moment, stunned by the other's presence. "Bar the doors," the Seeker said. "I think not," Tamaz responded. He strode forward and grabbed the man, pulling him away from the other 2. Time seemed to slow, and the prince felt himself swept forward. He didn't know what he intended to do, but the rage that had festered in him in the dungeon had taken control, and he was simply acting. He drew his hand back and punched the man full in the face. Tamaz released the Seeker in surprise, and the man went reeling backward, nose crushed flat, before he fell to the floor, bloody and unconscious. There was a stunned silence from all parties, even the exile girl, and then both searchers simply turned and fled. Both of the exiles turned to the prince with wary looks. He realized that he was flushed and breathing heavily. "He threw me in a dungeon," he said by way of explanation. The girl looked at Tomas. "Okay, we can keep him." An arrow shot past the prince's nose, and he jumped back with a very unprincely yelp. It thudded into the wooden wall behind him, and he felt a small trickle of blood well up on the bridge of his nose. The shot had been terrific, and fired through the open door to their right. "Time to go," the girl said. She disappeared through the door on the left, the one that led back into Bainland City proper, and the prince followed quickly behind, with Tomas right behind him in turn. They ran quickly through the shadows, sounds of alarm ringing out all around them. Members of the High Blood began emerging from their houses, some with looks of outrage on their faces, others scared and alarmed. The street lamps, which had been dimmed for the night, were suddenly flaring into unnaturally bright light, and the prince felt a familiar dread creep through him. His hands began to tingle, and his stride became slightly erratic. "Blood mages are here," he told the exiles as they moved through the shadows of a garden. "We need to leave. If I stay close, they'll be able to feel me the way I can feel people, and they'll follow me like bloodhounds." "We came in over the wall, the way I followed you," the exile girl said. The memory of that night came back to the prince. It had been real. How scared he had been of her, how certain he had been that she was coming to kill him or stop him from reaching the Seeker. "Were you following me to stop me, or just to see where I went?" She did not respond. "Now is not the time," Tomas said. "We came in over the wall. Is that way still safe?" The prince paused, then nodded. "No one should know about it but the Seekers. Chances are the guards don't even know there's anything more than an abandoned guardhouse up there. I would bet that way is much easier to get through than the gates." Immediately, both exiles turned and ran for the stables, trusting him completely, just as if he'd never betrayed them. For a brief instant, he couldn't catch his breath, but then he was running just as hard as they were.